everyone, and welcome to another episode of Leadership Lab Notes, powered by IG Advisors. This is a limited edition video podcast where we dive deeper into all things social and environmental impact leadership. I am Caitlin, an advisor at IG Advisors, and your resident producer and host, and I'm joined by my wonderful colleague, Elena, if you want to say hi.
Hello, I'm Elena, intern and a co-producer of this wonderful space.
And to give you a little bit of context about who we are at IG Advisors, we are a strategy consulting firm and we work with the philanthropy, business and non-profit spaces for social and environmental change. We are coaches, mentors and leaders ourselves, and we deliver the Leadership Lab training program, which is a 6-week program for any social environmental impact leader looking to level up their skills. And we'll be adding all of the links to the Leadership Lab, to IG Advisors in the description of this video. But for today's very exciting episode, we're going to be talking about feminist leadership in a resource crisis, which I'm really, really excited about because it's a super timely topic for us. I'm sure many of you will have seen the announcement from Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, about having to restructure given financial and resource constraints. A lot of the organisations and partners we're speaking to right now in the feminist gender justice space are saying that there's a huge need for more resource and more leadership in deciding where resource goes. So I'm very, very excited for today's episode, which, speaking of, I think it's time to hand over to today's guest speaker. So Ledys, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. My name is Ledys Sanjuan, and I am a global strategic communication strategist with more than 10 years experience in feminist philanthropy and social movement organizing. I particularly want to talk about my experience on why I can talk about this, and that is that I have been an advocate for feminist resourcing when I was part of Frida the Young Feminist Fund and also as part of my work with Phenomenal Funds. So I have spent a lot of my career talking to funders about how and why to fund feminist movements. So I have like an understanding of pulse on what's happening. So this is why I'm talking about this today, because I think it's really, really important that we bring this to the table, that we start talking about this, and that funders listen to what feminist movements need and that they resource them. So.
Thank you so much for being here with us. We're really excited for this conversation. So let's start from the groundwork. How would you define feminist leadership?
I think for me, feminist leadership is just inherently a transformational and basically collective endeavor. So I don't think that feminist leaders are necessarily superheroes that are being talked about always and who have very sparkly CVs. I think feminist leadership is taking place in different ways, and I think as feminists we are here. We always legitimize those collective spaces. But I also wanted to talk about the definition from wearefeministleaders.org, which is an organization that is dedicated to the development of feminist leaders within the philanthropic and nonprofit space. So they say, we are feminist leaders. We are shaking up how organizations work. We are power sharing, ego checking, accountable leaders. We build trust, not rivalry, collaboration and not competition. We dismantle the inequalities of gender, race, sexual orientation, class, and more that deny people a voice. We break down bias and reject leadership models that hold everyone back. We guide organizations of every size towards a better and fairer future. We are feminist leaders. We transform work together. And I think I would add to this that feminist leadership is also practicing what you preach. So I think it's really, which is where everybody really struggles. We all write really beautiful manifestos. But I think a feminist leader is somebody who is striving to practice. So it's not, like I say, it's not always the person who is, the most known, because there are other feminist leaders who are also trying to practice their values and morals, and who are developing their organizations and who are working towards these goals. So yeah, that's how I think I would define feminist leadership.
I love that definition, and also agree with what you added to it, that it's also about practicing what you preach. And in the last episode as well, we were discussing this of how like it's easy to say things and theoretically things make sense, but then to put them into practice is a bit harder. It takes that extra step.
I love that. And I guess following on from that, today's podcast is all about feminist leadership in the context of this resource crisis. So I was wondering, could you provide a bit more context about what the state of funding for feminist and gender justice causes looks like right now? And then alongside that, what are the implications for leadership in this space? What are the needs? How is leadership relevant to these conversations around resource crises?
I think the reason why we talk about crisis is because we are seeing organizations like FRIDA, but other organizations who defend abortion rights like Shrink. And we are also seeing how there is like a big number of organizations that are having to restructure and kind of like slim down. And this has an impact on feminist leadership in several ways. And number one is that the feminist movement is already severely underfunded. It's as little as 0.2% of the resources available for all social movements go to feminists, and so we already have like a lack of the presence of feminists in philanthropy, in big spaces in philanthropy. We have an absence of feminists in media. We have an absence of feminists in a lot of spaces where there's like big decision making that is happening. And so with these other people that are kind of like being laid off and like now are in the job market, there's also more competition. No, there's also more people who are like going after the same jobs. So I think that's one of the really big issues, because it's not only a competition of resources, it's also a competition of jobs. I think that's really important. And then I also want to talk about like the role of crisis here, because I think that feminist leadership has like an opportunity, but also kind of like a challenge with this crisis. But first, I want to talk about like why is it a crisis? No, which is what you kind of also wanted me to answer. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw big funders like the Novo Foundation, like OSF, close down or diminish the work that goes directly into feminist movements. Not This is not to say that all of their streams of work that were going to gender justice were closed, but they were kind of like slimmed down and then put into other spaces. So, for example, if there's a climate justice in Latin America department, then like, oh, we fund these collectives through here, and so through the lens of intersectionality, say yes, but we're intersectional, we're an intersectional funder, so we don't need to call ourselves like feminists, or we don't need to have like a feminist department or a feminist or a women's rights program. But in this way, also kind of like erasing what are some of these with these investments, no? So this is to say, okay, these programs were closed, but we're not necessarily seeing that there's not necessarily like a complete erasure of those funds, no? So the resource crisis, sometimes I'm like, is it true? Because there's also other funders who are investing in feminist movements, like Mackenzie Scott, and then there's Melinda Gates just announcing like her grants, and there's just like a lot of opportunities that are emerging, and I think some organizations are just more well placed to absorb these opportunities than others for different reasons. I also think that the resource crisis is also a political crisis, because with what's happening in Palestine. A lot of organizations, particularly feminist organizations, that spoke out against the genocide of Palestinians, they received backlash from funders, and so yeah, like I think we're seeing just like a different. There's just like different fronts that are very difficult, but then there are fronts that are, to me, are very hopeful too. I want to also highlight the small family foundations, because small family foundations are are driving like a really important resources towards towards feminist movements, or towards movements that are not traditionally funded. And also they are people who, in some cases, not in all of them, but in a lot of cases, are willing to be very flexible about their funding. And so there's an opportunity to get in touch with these people, to bring them forward, to bring them together, that I think is also emerging. So the crisis is not necessarily all negative, is what I'm trying to say. There's just like more to the picture, but like I say, there are these important, at least, perceptions of scarcity that are driving, at least, competition. And also there is, for example, like, but I don't know if I'm extending too much, but I'll just say one last thing. And I think there's also a question here about, the type of leadership that is being elevated versus the type of leadership that is kind of like letting it slide. So obviously, young feminists are the first ones to bear the brunt of, standing up against what's happening, and like waking up the nonprofit movement to what's happening to human rights, in the context of today. Um, and so I do think that it is important to see like who's giving an opportunity, and then who's not being given an opportunity, because there's a lot of power involved. Yeah, I'll just leave it there because I said a lot of things. So.
There is so much in what you said that really, really resonates with what we've seen. So that question of when resource feels less scarce, it's much more difficult to take a feminist approach to leadership in practice. As you said, there are so many feminist values around collaboration, collective care, and when you don't have resource to invest in looking after yourself and your team and pay good salaries, when it feels like you're constantly scrambling and in competition with others, it's very hard to live up to those feminist values in practice. And I also found it really interesting, your observation around a lot of funders are kind of mainstreaming gender within their other programs and thematic areas. And that is wonderful. But I think the point is, it isn't either or, it's both and. You can both be mainstreaming gender across your entire portfolio and offering specialist funds focused on gender justice, because there is a real need for very specialist support and specialist programs. And your reflection on Gates and Scott funding is it leads very nicely onto our next question, because I think a lot of people perceive the space as quite well funded because of those big heavyweight funders. And that means it's very easy for people to think to themselves, oh, well, that's not my problem, they've got it covered. So yeah, this is a very nice transition onto our next question, which I'm going to hand over to Eleanor.
Yeah, so like within this times of crisis, of like funding crisis, what are the main challenges for feminist leaders?
I think one of the questions with Mackenzie Scott, for example, is around long-term funding, right? And you provide $10 million or $5 million or whatever to an organization once, and it's great because it's not tied. Okay, that's great, but then what happens? I think this is one of the things that the trust-based philanthropy blog has talked about, and they were like they they recently, you know, went into this and they said, okay, but like, what is the relationship there? You know, because you're supposed to do, for example, I wanted to bring an example of Humanity United, who are a small they started a small family foundation. They're not small, but it's because we say small because, you know, they don't have like the 1,000 workers of the Ford Foundation, but like they move money, they move a lot of money, and I ran into them at this Shift the Power conference that took place here in Colombia in December, and they were asking these questions, you know, like, okay, how do we fund movements better? How do we fund them in a way that is like a partnership? But also, how do we um, get rid of the money? O sea, like that we spend down. How do we, you know? So there are foundations who are like really, 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 really tackling things from like a very progressive lens. They're so wealthy that they're just like, can I just like give this money out? Like, but and that's great, and it's like, and yes, and also we would love it if we could like engage with you, because if we so I think this goes back to the question of accountability that you mentioned also, Caitlin, because you know, organizations like Frida, and I remember this is how I got to know you, because you had the podcast on Mackenzie Scott, and one of the things that I reflect on with this is that Frida, you know, they put a statement about wealth inequality and how philanthropy should be like about redistribution. And this is where I think feminist leadership is so important, because they are saying, yes, okay, you can give us this money, but like, what does it mean? And how can we build a relationship? Because this isn't about you just giving away your money. This is about wealth and inequality, and this is about you being accountable. So how is Mackenzie Scott accountable to the feminist movement? How is Melinda Gates accountable to the feminist movement? And feminist activists do care about this, because a lot of feminist activists, a lot of social movement activists, regardless of whether they're feminists or not, they are not necessarily so interested in the money. They're interested in like, how did we get here? How did I get to be an activist in the first place? Well, because we live in a world where there's this massive inequality, so it's not enough that you give this money, no? And this is where I think it's so important that you know, feminist leaders are able to raise their voices and hold these funders accountable. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge because, as we are seeing in this resource crisis, or at least there is a mentality that there is a crisis and there is a scarcity mindset that, you know, you might be like, do I want the organization to exist for 3 more years? And then I just don't say anything about this for this moment, or do I want to lose this funder? And you know, so I think that's a big challenge. It's a big challenge for feminist leaders. You know, that is being faced today. Like, when you are responsible for paying people, you're responsible for paying organizations, entire organizations. You might be like, I'm actually not going to challenge my biggest funder. I'm actually just going to take the money and sit down. And that's okay. Like, because you're being pragmatic, and we need the feminist organization to exist for 10 more years, please, you know? It's like, it's okay. You're just balancing things, you know? It's a tough decision. It's a tough balance that I think a lot of feminist leaders are facing today.
I totally agree with what you're saying, and as you mentioned before, it's not just a resource crisis, but it's also very political, because feminist leaders are faced with this decision of, do I speak my mind and am radical in the beliefs that we stand for, or do we keep this money? And it's very tricky. It's a very tricky balance, and because these feminist leaders and feminist organizations are like take it to heart to create this discourse also around where the wealth comes from. So like with the Gates and Scott, it's not just about taking the money, but it's also like, reflect on why do you have that money, where does that money comes from, and changing the discourse is very political, and it does sometimes mean pulling of fundings and like getting less money from donors and stuff. So I agree that it's a very tricky balance to strike.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our conversation, which I've really, really enjoyed and found fascinating. But I want to end on something more hopeful. So do you have... yeah, I'm like, please, can we find something hopeful to talk about? So Ledys, do you have any pieces of advice for feminist leaders? Is there anything that's making you hopeful right now? What do you want to leave us on?
I'm sorry, I don't bring it down. I'm a Scorpio. This is why. This is my ability. But I think my main, advice, or I would say three things. First, I think there's other places to move funding. So there's organizations that are moving people of wealth. So not necessarily Mackenzie Scott. There's people who are smaller and who are also able, who are also keen and eager. There's spaces where like we don't really see that many feminist organizations or feminist funds who are funders who are moving money. Yeah, there's just like a lot of forums that are really important, I think, to highlight. I also think that I want to really highlight the work of organizations like the Alliance for Feminist Movements, the Count Me In Consortium, the Gender Collab Coalition, and Phenomenal Funds, because all of these organizations are advancing important advocacy work to get funders to be more flexible and to fund feminist movements, and some of them are tackling like more difficult, like the governments, and I think their work is super important, and I really think following them, reading what they are saying about the ecosystem, how they are analyzing the feminist funding ecosystem, I think it's really valuable. I also think it's important to capitalize on other ways of funding. So, like I mentioned, the Shift the Power movement, which is led by the Global Fund for Community Foundations. They highlight, or what they're trying to do with the Shift the Power movement is basically like move away from the dependence that we have on money and on people of like wealth that is like money and move other resources that we have, like social, political, like there's just other community resources that we can pull together, and they are bringing really, 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 really important conversations to the table. I think also funding diverse funding streams, and I think a lot of people, because I understand, because you can move with one funder $10 million, but I also think a lot of people have moved away from the individual donations, and for example, like things that are very traditional, like giving circles. They are ways of moving resources that feminists have traditionally used, women traditionally used. Actually, like it's a very old feminist women thing to do giving circles, and some people raise a lot of money with those. And I think we have just like completely focused on specific forum, and I think there's other spaces that is important for us to move and explore into, and spend some energy mobilizing.
Yeah, I really love your point about the resource beyond financial resource that is out there. And for me, one of the beautiful, beautiful things about the feminist movement is the care, the solidarity, the community. And there is so much power in that, as well as being very pragmatic about the way the current capitalist world works. And we do need the financial resource, but also we have so much other resource to draw on. Well, wow. Thank you so much, Ledys. That was a wonderful, wonderful conversation. We really, really appreciate having you with us. Thank you to everyone who has watched today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please do like, comment, subscribe, stay tuned for more. We're going to drop links to all of our LinkedIns in the description to this video. And we're also going to link you to our Leadership Lab training program, which Ledys actually participated in. She was one of our wonderful leaders. So if you want to connect with other amazing, inspiring people like Ledys, please do take a look and consider applying. That's it for today. Thank you so much, and see you soon.
Thank
Bye.
you.